It's a pink sloth. Squish. So, Straw Hat separation. So, this one is kind of more of an odd duck in this series, mostly because these are a cover page series that show where the Straw Hats end up after Sabaody, where each of them end up, besides Luffy, since we're mostly following his story in the manga, with Amazon Lily and Impel Down and Marineford and everything. These cover page series for the Straw Hats separation serial goes over what the other Straw Hats are doing. We also cut about 2 different points in the chapters in the actual manga and episodes in the anime, where we are seeing a little bit more of what they're up to and aftermath of these different places where they are based around what's going on with Luffy. So, I decided to kind of do this in a 2-part thing. So we're going to do the first 4 serials and their associated things. So Sanji, Robin, Franky, and Usopp. And then the next 4 in the next one for these. And that means I'm going to have 2 cover page tie-in videos for the characters. So you'll have to see who they are. And so for this, overview information. This is the Straw Hat separation serial, covers about it's not very long. It's only about 8 installments or so. Well, actually, it's about it should be about 16 installments because it's like 2 per each Straw Hat, and there's 8 of them, so that should be 16. But it's like 2 per Straw Hat. And it just essentially catches you up on like where the Straw Hats each got sent throughout the course of, Kuma, separating them at Sabaody, to show to you and to kind of affirm that no, they're fine. They're mostly in safe situations or semi-safe situations. So we get that, which is useful. Just kind of shows where they each ended up and introduces us to some new characters and some new interesting islands or places that we haven't been to before. And then, of course, in the anime, these are adapted into about 8 episodes, give or take, and they go over, each section gets, kind of shown for like what each of the different Straw Hats are up to, the separated Straw Hats are up to on their various little adventures. Some are a little more fun than others. Considering that Robin kind of gets captured and tortured, unfortunately. And then, of course, the anime episodes, as I said, some of them expand on some of these. Some of them are a little more follow the manga pretty closely, but expand in a couple of areas, which is fine. Robin's is kind of the one that gets the most expanded, and I do like that, and I'll touch on that when I get to Robin's more. So we get that. So we're going to go over the first 4 sections. And of course, one thing that we do learn later that does tie into this when we're getting Kuma's flashbacks through Bonnie's eyes, we learn that each one of these islands is an island that Kuma visited on his travels to try to find a cure for Bonnie's sapphire scales. So that kind of ties in there, and that's why he sent a lot of the Straw Hats to these different islands, specific ones for specific people, obviously, based around, what he viewed of their fighting styles and other information that he had, and then like determined where to send them based on that. And, we learn that later on, that they each end up in a place that's generally going to make them stronger. Or at least that's the preferred answer there. So, we start off with Sanji, and he is resisting in Kamabaka, which is just funny. So, this one is essentially Sanji's Kamabaka Hell Insanity. And this one gets 2 cover pages. They're both simply, the first one is Sanji is just running away in terror from the Okamas on Kamabaka Kingdom, or the Kamabaka Queendom. And he's just running away from them. And then the second one jumps to, Sanji, his resistance fell, and he's finally the, simply girly version of himself. Which has resulted in so much fan art, it's not even funny. So we get that. More in depth in regards to what happens during this serial. So essentially, the anime expands a bit more on the Sanji stuff, but it still pretty much fits in. Also, the reason I have the sloth is because a lot of the animals that are on Momoyuro Island are very pink, and of course Momoyuro Island is very pink and blue, pinks and light reds and different things like that. Very, very girly type colors is the way that they're designed, because it's the other Isle of Maidens is the way that it's of course described. Luffy ends up on Amazon Lily, the Isle of Maidens, the Isle of Women. Sanji ends up here, just to contrast Sanji's version of hell. And what ends up happening is, of course, Sanji is, they kind of do this where Sanji lands on the beach, and he ends up coming across a lot of. So I'm just kind of going to go ahead and kind of play this in the anime because it's just really funny. He gets found on the beach, gets found by one of the Okama, who I believe is named Samantha. And, they're kind of taking care of him. And then Sanji, wakes up and he's still very hazy about what's going on. Chases her because, Sanji and what he perceives as a pretty girl follows her. And then realizes to his horror that this island is filled not with these beautiful, gorgeous women, in his opinion, and is just a bunch of transvestites human and animals. And Sanji, the Okama, he is just so disturbed by this, and he is just running away from them in horror because he is just like, because he can't take it, which is just so funny. And what they do in the anime, again, this is just funny. They have him, he has to end up fighting, because of course, Sanji is of course also of the mind of like, okay, well, if I'm okay, then that means that the others are probably okay too, after getting slapped away by Kuma. So I'm fine, so they have to be fine too, but I still need to get back to them. So Sanji is of course still focusing on like, I have to get back to the others. I have to get back to Sabaody, so he ends up going and talking to, in the anime, it's their kind of temporary queen. I want to say her name's Charlotte, but I don't remember. Their temporary queen, because of course, Ivankov is not there, so they have a temporary queen. Queendom's gotta have a queen. And Sanji essentially ends up fighting against their temporary queen and ends up, is forced to fight in a dress. And then I like how they show this, because in the chapter, in the volume covers and in the manga, or the chapter covers and then in the manga, it essentially just like, Sanji's running away from them. Sanji is now one of them. And this kind of like fills in that gap, which is just funny. And it's just like essentially, through whatever reasons, they girlify Sanji and make Sanji one of them, and he's in like this frilly dress and curly wig and high-heeled shoes and thick makeup, and he's frolicking on the beach with the Okamas and everything. And, so we see that. In the anime, they play it up as, like, he kind of fell for it. And then it's also implied that, he might be doing this against his will. It's, like, a little bit of what's implied, which is just funny. And then we cut back, and this is after, this is after the war. This is after, the war at Marineford and everything, and Ivankov has shown up. So Sanji is essentially, what happens is Sanji ends up getting the newspaper, and he reads the story about what happened with Luffy and Ace and Marineford and all of that stuff. And like we see, like we literally see in the anime, we see like the makeup just like melt off of him, and he just like gets so angry about this. Fair. And like that like snaps him out of this, because he'd been like in a happy-go-lucky girly type phase for the way that they do this, which is just kind of funny. And what ends up happening is, so he's reading through this, and he's like, oh my god, Luffy, and it's like kicking in, and he's like, okay, I gotta find a way to get back to Luffy. So thankfully, at that point in time is when Ivankov shows up, because of course, Ivankov, escaped Impel Down and helped Luffy at the war and all of that stuff, left Luffy in the care of Jinbei and the Heart Pirates, and then headed off back to to the Kamabaka Kingdom, so that way, that way he could get back to his kingdom where he needs to be. And what ends up happening is, of course, he shows up, but Ivankov is, of course, in his female form. And Sanji is, of course, like, oh, pretty lady in a Dominic's outfit, and is like trying to flirt with her, and then it shifts back, and Sanji is just disturbed by this. And then we get into the whole thing where it's like Sanji has to kind of prove that he's a Straw Hat, because of course Ivankov is going through and showing him the different posters and everything else like that. And then we get to Sanji's very badly drawn one, and he's like, and Ivankov's like, so is this you? And Sanji's like, there's a story behind and it's just like Sanji's frustration about this, because like Ivankov is like refusing to tell Sanji anything. And of course Sanji read in the newspaper that Ivankov helped Luffy escape. That Ivankov was kind of part of this little makeshift thing to help Luffy and Impel Down and get out and everything else like that. So he kind of knows that Ivankov has information. But Ivankov is refusing to tell Sanji anything. Because it's like he could be this spy for the government and the Marines, is kind of like where Ivankov is headed with this. And Ivankov has probably had to deal with like spies before, like with being part of the Revolutionary Army and everything else like that. Has probably had to deal with spies before, trying to like infiltrate. And in this case, it's like, oh, Sanji might be a spy from the world government or whatever, or the Marines, and is pretending to be a member of the Straw Hats. So we get that. And eventually what ends up happening is, of course, Ivankov does eventually kind of give in. Or there's a little bit of what happens here. So it's like they, Sanji tries to fight. Ivankov gets his butt kicked. The Okama try to put him in a dress again. He then ends up running away again, and he's like trying to get his hands on the newspaper so he can read about what's going on. And he's just like very much against all of that. He doesn't want to be on this island. This island is his version of hell, which of course we get later, because of course he has his hell memories attack that he develops and everything like that by thinking about having been here. So he tries to battle Ivankov to give him a boat, fails. Ivankov still won't give him any information, but he is giving him the newspaper, so at least he's, learning the general information about what's going on with Luffy. And Ivankov, I think, is like realizing that, like, okay, I think this guy is actually part of part of Straw Boy's crew. And he, so Ivankov's like figuring that up. And he's, of course, Sanji reads the newspaper and, of course, sees, the image of Luffy standing there with the 3D X out 2Y thing on his arm. And of course Sanji gets the message, and he's like, okay, I gotta do, I know what I have to do. So then we get into this where Sanji and and Ivankov are kind of discussing things a little bit more, trying to figure out what to do. And Sanji is actually like being very rude to Ivankov during all of this. And but he's not telling Ivankov what was in the article, so Ivankov's just annoyed. And then Sanji is, of course, eating some of the food from the Kamabaka Kingdom and finds out that they have this, like, attack cuisine that enhances your properties. And he asked Ivankov for the recipes, and because he wants to use these recipes to be able to help his crewmates, of course. We haven't really seen him use them that much. I think we see him cook one something of it on Punk Hazard, and I think that's it after everything that happens there when they have like the feast with like the, with the G8 guy or the G5 guys and Smoker and Tashigi and the, all of that stuff. But, so that's kind of what happens there. We don't get a huge amount of a payoff for it, but we'll see what happens. And Ivankov is just very blunt that he's not giving Sanji any of this. But he can go around the island and challenge if he defeats all of the 99 masters of the Newkama Kempo. Each time that you beat one, he would claim one of the 99 attack cuisine recipes. So that's like this thing to urge Sanji onward. Also, in having to fight all of them, it's going to make Sanji even stronger, and he has to travel around the island. The other thing is that while all of this is happening, while he's going through all these different fights, the other inhabitants of the island are going to be pursuing Sanji non-stop, trying to put the dress on him again. And if he managed to get through all of this, Ivankov would grant all of his wishes, including giving him a ship and all of that. And if he loses this, there was no guarantee that Sanji would keep his manhood. So that's just funny there. And Sanji is just kind of Sanji accepts this, and it's there's a couple of things going on in his head, because of course for Sanji, it's of course this whole thing of Luffy is my captain, and he just lost his brother. Clearly, Rayleigh has something going on here, because we saw Rayleigh mentioned in the article. So Rayleigh's doing something. Luffy gave us a signal to wait 2 years, and then we'll meet up again at Sabaody and, by Rayleigh and everything. So we got that. So I need to train. I need to get stronger. We weren't strong enough to, getting through Thriller Bark was really difficult with having to fight Oars and Moria and all of that. And then, of course, at Sabaody, they barely can put a dent in a bunch of the pacifistas, so they needed to get stronger anyway. They lost at Sabaody, so they need to all get stronger. And so Sanji does take it upon himself. He does accept this challenge, that this will make him stronger. And then, of course, he wants to earn the attack cuisine, because, of course, that goes on with him wanting to be one of the best chefs in the world and everything else like that. And, of course, having the attack cuisine will be useful to help him with being able to help his crewmates. Again, we don't get much of a payoff with the attack cuisine yet. We'll see what ends up happening with that. Besides a little bit of Punk Hazard, we might get more of it later. We'll see. I hope Oda didn't forget about it. Maybe that'll be something that gets brought up in Elbaf. That would be kind of fun. Or, well, by the time this video would go up, that may have already happened, but I have no idea. So we'll have to wait and see. Or by then I'll know that it happened or not. I don't know. So we get that. So that's what Sanji spends the next 2 years having to do, is run around on Kamabaka Kingdom, trying to keep fighting the different new Kama Kempo masters to get the attack cuisine recipes and avoid getting a dress put on him. I know, there's so much fan art and stuff of Sanji getting gender changed and then it messing the heck with Zoro, which is just funny. Okay. Into Robin. So Robins are how terrible you people are. And Robins, they do such terrible things type of thing. So Robin's short summary is she ends up on Tequila Wolf, which is a very, very long bridge that is being built by a bunch of enslaved citizens, enslaved individuals from the One Piece world. And they are thankfully soon liberated by the revolutionaries, by the Revolutionary Army, specifically led by Bunny Joe, because Bunny Joe. He gets to do some other stuff here in a moment. And then Robin, of course, ends up spending the 2-year time skip with the revolutionaries. And that's where she meets Sabo and Koala and Hack and all of that stuff. And presumably Dragon at some point in time. So we get a lot of that there for Robin. Longer summary, which this is one of the ones that I do like in the anime that they expanded upon. Because it gives us It doesn't do anything that, like, negates any information that we get in the cover page series. It doesn't negate any other information that we've been given in the story. But it just kind of expands upon the lives of the people who live on Tequila Wolf and the other different bridges that are being built around the wolf. It's like Vodka Wolf, Rum Wolf. I don't remember what the other one was. There's 4 of them. They're all named after different types of alcohol, and I don't remember what the other one was. I'm sorry. And of course, these bridges are, Robin ends up on this island. And I'm just kind of go through what we see in the anime, because it's a very, the anime does pretty good at showing what's going on. So Robin ends up landing on Tequila Wolf, which is, of course, this very snow-covered area on the bridge. And she is found by this little girl named Soren, and who's out, like, collecting scraps of wood. We'll get back to what Soren's going to do later. I love Soren. I have talked about her before. A lot of the characters in this story in these cover page series, I have talked about before, because I made, like, a series about, like, the Straw Hats getting reunited with some of these characters in the past. Or possibly getting reunited with them in the future. The videos I already did a while ago. Reasons for, like, potential allies that the Straw Hats could come across again. And I did talk about Soren for, like, the One Piece, like, reunion type things for the Straw Hat reunions with other characters. So, what ends up happening is, I'm going off what happens here in the anime, because it doesn't really shift what happens in the cover page series at all, or much different than what happens in the manga. So, Soren takes Robin back to where Soren lives in, like, the barracks, in essentially, like, the homes where they live, where the workers live while they are building on the bridge. Soren and, like, she kind of hides Robin in the attic, and Soren ends up explaining to Robin that she's lived here pretty much her whole life, that this is a bridge between islands that has been being built for the past 700 years. And it's just, like, this horrible thing that, like, all of these people have been enslaved and are being forced to build this bridge. And it's just generations upon generations upon generations. And later on in the story, when we see them, later on when we see Robin leave here at the Revolutionaries, we see other sets of places that have been built up and abandoned as they move further and further down the bridge. Now, given information that we know now about the oceans rising or the islands sinking, these bridges being built was probably something more ordered by Imu or the Gorosei in order to facilitate the fact that it's like, well, we know that the ocean levels are going to keep rising, and we're going to want to at least have some type of ability to go from one island to the next, depending on certain circumstances, or from certain parts of the Red Line to other certain islands, or different things like that. For fun travel purposes, because reasons. And they probably ordered these bridges to be built, and of course for the past 700 years these 4 bridges have continually been built upon generations and generations and generations on the backs of slaves and people who were, maybe instead of being killed in the human hunting contest, people who were captured and enslaved and brought here instead, and just all of that stuff. And of course, like, they have, like, the horrible guards that just abuse them and everything, and, like, try to turn them against each other and all of this stuff. So Robin kind of gets to know Soren, and Soren is, like, this little artist, and she's adorable, and she's probably about 8, 9, maybe 10 years old. And she likes to draw on these little planks of wood, scraps of wood, these different islands that she think it would be so fun to get to go and see. And, like, one of the islands reminds Robin of Skypiea, and Robin, like, tells Soren different stories about some of the islands that she's been to and everything else like that. And Soren loves it because it gives her, like, inspiration and hope and everything. And so we get that. Eventually, unfortunately, what ends up happening is other people who live there with Soren find out about Robin, and Robin kind of gets ratted on. And she ends up getting, she does badass thing, beats up a bunch of soldiers, then surrenders herself in order to try to lessen the harm on Soren. And Robin gets captured and is taken into, like, the head guy's office and everything, in handcuffs and everything. And she is then essentially beaten by him. And, like, she keeps asking why the bridge was being built, and he says, you don't need to know that, and everything else like that. Probably because he doesn't even know why anyway. And so we see a lot of that. Robin gets beaten up. We, of course, get the very sexy images of her in the, prison jumpsuit with, like, her cleavage hanging out, because reasons, and why the heck not? And it's the guards being horny and stupid. And Robin, like, takes the beating. She's been through worse. And eventually what ends up happening is the revolutionaries show up. And they are led by Bunny Joe, who, of course, they free all of the enslaved people, and they free Robin and all of that stuff, and Tequila Wolf is liberated. Robin is then essentially asked to go with the Revolutionary Army, to come with them. And Robin does accept. We do have the anime where she is, like, saying goodbye to Soren and everything, like, wishing her luck. Again, they're not canon. They could be ones that could just be very easily canonized, and that would be kind of fun just to have that happen. Because, like, all the other Straw Hat characters, while they're off on the different islands, they each end up making friends. Because, like, okay, Saji doesn't necessarily make friends with the Okama, but he reluctantly does admit that, like, that Ivankov did help him and everything. Robin doesn't really make any friends in the cover page series. Yes, she ends up being able to make friends with Sabo, Koala, and Hack and everything in the Revolutionary Army while she's there, but her having this little connection to Soren, I think, is helpful. So we get that. Then we cut to post-war, where Robin is reading in the newspaper about what's been going on. And gets caught up on what's going on with Luffy and everything. And, Robin is, of course, talked to as, like, the survivor from the nation who fought against the world, Ohara, and everything like that. So referencing her being the demon child of Ohara and everything. And Dragon had told the revolutionaries, told Bunny Joe and such, to, like, protect Robin at, like, all costs with the best of their abilities. And they do. And they offer Robin the ability to go and meet with Dragon, and she declines because she, of course, wants to make her way back to her crew, as do all of the others. So they're riding in this carriage toward the end of the bridge. They pass through some of the other construction sites from, like, 300 years ago, and Robin is just, like, disgusted by this and inquires information. Of course, they give her the information that they know of. And what ends up happening is essentially what ends up happening is Robin gets some other information about what, Tequila Wolf and everything, and a little bit more information about the Revolutionary Army, and then she ends up reading the newspaper article about Luffy at Marineford, where he's praying at Marineford afterwards, and that he's alive, and sees, of course, the 3D2Y message, and she decides to stay with the Revolutionary Army. That was her, captain's orders type of thing. So she does stay with the Revolutionary Army, and she does agree to go to Baltico with them. And we have this little bit. We have this moment. So there's a couple of things. Robin finds out that the Revolutionary Army have been looking for her for a long time. And because of other things that we learn later, we, of course, know that Dragon had this connection to Ohara, whether or not that was he knew Olivia, probably knew Clover is what it's implied, just like Vegapunk did. So it's, that, like, Dragon had these connections back to Ohara as well. So him wanting to keep Robin safe, that's all those kind of ties into, it's one of the things that makes people think that there's a theory that, like, Robin is Dragon's daughter, therefore she's Luffy's half-sister. All of that. Don't know what to tell you there, people. I don't know where I fall on that answer. But Bunny Joe tells her that they had been looking for her almost since what happened at Ohara, and they didn't know that she had been working under Crocodile for so long, otherwise they would have tried to find her. Robin says that she was happy that it worked out this way because it meant that she got to have her crew. She gets to have her friends and everything. And she found her, her true friends, her real friends, and everything like that, which is great. From there, the Revolutionary Armies get her to the ship. They, offer to bring her into the office. She's like, I'm not going to be alone in a room with people I don't know. So Bunny Joe is like getting her, bring her a chair, a table, food, and warm clothing and blankets to keep her warm out here on the deck, so she's at least comfortable where she can feel more aware of her surroundings and being trapped in a room. So we get that. From there, we have it, of course, that Robin then spends the next, the 2-year time skip on Baltigo with the Revolutionary Army. She gets to be friends with Sabo, Koala, and Hack and all of that stuff. She gets to learn some different types of Fishman karate, possibly gets to learn hockey, but we never get a full answer on that. Why the heck not is beyond me, Robin. And the other thing that is just so fascinating about this that's so kind of interesting about this is Robin has known the Straw Hats for a couple of months, if that, depending on stuff, by the time everything happens at Sabaody, between when she joins at Alabasta and when everything happens at Sabaody. She's only known the Straw Hats for a couple of months, if that. And she spends like a year and a half or so with the Revolutionary Army. She spends more time with them than she did with the Straw Hats. And yet, when it's time, she's like, I thank you for everything. Don't worry, Sabo. I won't tell Luffy that you're alive because you're an idiot. And I'm going to head back to Sabaody now. And that's what happens. And she, of course, joins back up with the Straw Hats. Now we get to Frankie. Frankie's one is like in the anime, they do a little bit of expanding on a few things here and there, but not a huge amount. It's just more gag stuff, really, which is just funny. Comedy bits. Frankie is this week's Me is no good. And he ends up on, so short summary is he ends up on Karakuri Island, which is of course the former home of Vegapunk, ends up interacting with a bunch of the cyborg animals, a guy and his grandson, and then eventually he ends up living in Vegapunk's house for the time frame, and his former lab, and uses a bunch of that information. Chip, baby. Boo, I love you. Can I come up here? Chip got a bath and got his nails trimmed yesterday, so he's all nice and clean. Are you a clean baby? Yeah, I know. And so Frankie improves himself, physically, literally. So Frankie ends up, more expanded version of this. Frankie lands on Karakuri Island, where he is found, or the future country of Baltimore, which I mentioned before because I mentioned it in the Enel cover page series, because that is where the little automatons come from, was Baltimore, was Karakuri Island, which, again, in that one, it's more of a temperate climate, and then in this one, we learn that, like, Karakuri is a winter island, very much so. And what ends up happening is Frankie ends up on Karakuri Island, and he ends up meeting two of the local people, Keaton and his grandfather, who never gets a name, and then their cybernetic dog, Tarimo, whatever. And Frankie ends up learning a lot about kind of, the life here on the island, that it's a very hard life in regards to the fact that it's always winter all the time. There are also a ton of cyborg animals all over the island because Vegapunk created them. And this is kind of something that, like, okay, so we see, like, the cyborg animals here, and then much, much later, we, of course, see the cybernetic sea beasts at Egghead Island, and we get to see, like, how far his, abilities have grown in this circumstances. We also Baltimore is, of course, where Vegapunk is from. That's where he was born. He tried to build, like, the heating implement in the island, to try to, make it a more temperate climate so it would work better. We, of course, see a lot of that in those inventions come to fruition on Egghead because, of course, Egghead was originally a winter island, and then via Vegapunk's stuff and the aircon and the heating and everything else like that he did, he was able to, make it a much more temperate and tropical climate to be in. I can hear him in the background. Boo, yeah, Boo. Good baby. He's good little baby, Boo. You're a good little pupper, Boo. And what ends up happening is, so in the anime, they add in this bit where Franky is, of course, low on cola, and he ends up needing to have different, something else. So, he's kind of frozen over, so they take him in and they have him looked over by the doctors. And instead of cola, they end up putting tea into him instead. Just, very fine, cultured British tea. And then Franky just, becomes a gentleman, which is just hilarious. A gentleman in a Speedo, which is just hilarious. And then they eventually have it that, Kita just, shoves him into the thing, because he's like, I want the fun robot back. I want the fun cyborg back. You're not fun anymore. And, eventually, they end up at Vegapunk's lab, and Franky ends up getting his hands on cola, and he ends up getting chased by the animals, and blah, 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 blah. So, Franky goes through a bunch of that stuff, eventually ends up getting cola, and ends up being in Vegapunk's lab. Then we get into the post-war arc. So, of course, Franky is, learning that this is where Vegapunk is from and all of that stuff. And he's like, oh yeah, he did a lot of inventing for the Navy. And, Franky is, really aware of who Vegapunk is. That would make sense for Franky to know who that is. And he ends up, in Vegapunk's old lab. And he's, looking through all of his notes and everything. And, of course, we get a couple of things that happen here. So, Franky is in the lab, and he pulls a chopper. He's looking around, and he ends up seeing this giant button on the wall that has a skull and crossbones on it. And he knows that he needs an icebreaker ship to get out, and he's looking for something that might be able to help with that, because the Navy have them, but he's not gonna, or the Marines have them, but he knows the Marines are not gonna help him because he's got a bounty poster. And Franky ends up pushing the button that has the skull and crossbones on it, and that just blows up Vegapunk's lab. Just boom. No more lab. And Keaton and his grandfather are just like, oh God, as they see that happen, and all the Marines are, oh God, what happened? And eventually Keaton and his grandpa end up there. And, because they think that Franky's dead, and they get there, and it's just like, no, Franky's not dead. Most of his skin got blown off because, he's a cyborg, and they get freaked out by the fact that he's, kind of gone melted Terminator on them for the way that he looks. And he ends up, it ended up being there was a sub-basement that didn't get blown up. And then Franky is okay, so he's interacting with them, and they're scared of him. Keaton and his grandfather are scared of him, so Franky ends up putting on this tiger rug to try to make it less scary, I guess, because a cyborg skeleton in a tiger rug is less scary because reasons. And then, of course, Franky ends up accidentally setting himself on fire. Franky ends up setting himself on fire, and then ends up running around and scaring the crap out of the Marines, which is just funny. Ends up scaring the crap out of the Marines. Ends up scaring the crap out of the Marines, which is just hilarious because, his skin's blown off, just metal skeleton running around, tiger on fire, just, yeah, I'd be running too. And then he spends essentially, is okay, well, I'm gonna, he reads about, in the newspaper, he gets the information about, what's going on with Luffy and everything, the 3D2Y message, and he's okay, well, I'm gonna stay here. And he then ends up spending the next, during the whole time skip, he is just building and building and building and building. And of course, he becomes known as the legend of the sacred burning beast of Baltimore type of thing. And he's like, builds a bunch of these different weapons to add on to the Sunny and everything else like that. And he is friends with like Keaton and his grandpa during this time frame. And he learns so much about stuff from reading all of Vegapunk's notes and everything else like that. And he uses a lot of that stuff like for his lasers and stuff like that, and the Gao cannon and other upgrades that he then ends up implementing in the Sunny later on when he gets back to Sabaody. And I think if I remember correctly, Franky is the first one to get back to Sabaody because he knows he's going to be having to spend some time there getting the ship upgraded before the rest of the Straw Hats show up. And he does. And of course, Franky, of course, not just modifies the ship, he has modified the heck out of himself and made himself even stronger, and a bunch of stuff. So we get that. And Cola. And now we move on to our last one for this video, because I knew these were going to be long, because I have like 16, 17 pages of notes for this cover page series, which is so much more than the others because I'm tying in the other stuff that happens in regards to when the Straw Hats are all separated. So now we get to talk about Usopp's. And it's I'll die if I'm on my own disease. So, short summary, Usopp ends up in the Bowen Archipelago, which are the giant carnivorous plant islands, which I was trying to describe to my mom last night, and she wasn't quite getting it. She was trying, but wasn't quite clicking into how it worked, where he meets Heracles, who is a botanist, and then Usopp ends up learning how to use pop greens, is essentially what happens. So, what ends up happening? Usopp lands on the Bowen Archipelago, and he, of course, ends up in the Forest of Thieves, which is where, like, it's all of these giant, the giant insects and everything else like that, so he's having to fight against the giant insects. Thankfully, he ends up getting saved from an oversized stag beetle by Heracles, who is a human. He just has, like, a beetle helmet on. And we do not know what he looks like underneath it. And of course, Heracles has the habit of... Heracles has a couple of fun habits. He calls himself Heraclesin and calls Usopp Usoppin, just for how he talks. He also is very energetic, repeats himself a lot, and introduces himself a lot. Dude's been on the island on his own for a long time. I don't blame him for this. And what ends up happening is he then quickly introduces Usopp to several of the other areas, including the area of the island that is kind of like the Forest of Gluttony area, where of course Usopp just like just eats everything and gets super, super fat. It's like, to be fair, Luffy and Chopper would be chowing down here as well. And then that's just what happens in the cover page series. Usopp ends up in there, meets Heracles, gets fat. We cut back after the war where Usopp has just kind of been like gorging himself. And he gets the information from the news coup about the, Summit War and Ace dying and the message from Luffy with the 3D2Y and everything. And what ends up happening is, of course, Usopp then ends up finding out that this place is a giant carnivorous plant. And Heracles kept trying to warn him, but he wasn't listening. And then Plant decides to go, okay, time for food. And tries to eat Usopp and Heracles, along with a sea hippo that made its way onto the island. There are several things that happen here. So Usopp tries to fight against one of the beetles, gets beaten up. Sea hippo shows up, ends up getting eaten by the island. And there's actually this kind of really great way that they do this in the anime, where as the island is closing, Usopp is having this realization, and then like as it opens back up again because it swallowed the sea hippo, as it's opening back up again, Usopp is having this realization of like, I have to get stronger. My skills so far have been barely adequate for what we have gone through. I need to get stronger. And he does. He very much takes it upon himself, and he does get stronger. So what ends up happening is Usopp ends up asking Usopp asks Heracles if Heracles can start teaching him about how to survive on the island and everything else like that. Usopp is like, I also gotta go on a diet and do a bunch of cardio to get rid of all of this built up, which, credit to Usopp, he pulls it off. He trains damn hard in that regard. And he gets like a 6-pack or an 8-pack by the time he's back with the rest of the Straw Hats at Sabaody. So good on him. He lost the weight and he's done good there. But what ends up happening is, of course, he ends up asking, he kind of sees the way that Heracles fights, and he ends up asking Heracles about that. And Heracles is like, well, I use pop greens. And he starts to explain to Usopp how the pop greens work. And he starts to, Usopp then spends the time skip learning how to fight with the pop greens, how to grow the pop greens, and like all of these other different variations of like how to use them and everything. There's the offensive and the defensive ones. There's the more practical use ones like the banana boat or the sprinkler or different things like that ones that we've seen Usopp use throughout the course of the story. And the skull bomb grass, which was kind of prominent on Elbaf for using it there against Gunko a couple of times. And he uses that, and he is using this opportunity so that he can grow stronger and become a true Cyber King. And of course, when everybody shows back up at Sabaody, Usopp is so much stronger than when he was when he left. He also has his Kabuto that he is then able to use. That is actually like a plant that is his freaking his freaking slingshot. And of course he has like his bag of pop greens, and of course on the ship on the Sunny, he does end up making a garden of pop greens. That way he can keep his supply going. For what ends up happening later, we kind of see that in, I think it's in Z. We see him like taking care of his garden and everything. So that finishes up the first part for this. There will be a tie-in video for a character discussion for the next video for this, and then I'll do the second part for the rest of the Straw Hats for Chopper, Nami, Brook, and Zoro. So that's what I have here. I thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye!